Mic check, check. Justin Hunt, it's all happening. Joining me today, all-star panel of music criticism throughout the history of modern media, I'd say. I think that's fair to say. We have prominent voices from every era of modern media in this conversation, so I'm actually really excited about it. First up, the internet's busiest music nerd. I say this all the time because I believe it with my heart. He has the last consequential music reviews in the space. Anthony Fantano, 9-second applause.
Hey, hi. Hi, thanks for having me. Hey.
Word up, thanks for joining me. Also on the panel, a huge influence of mine, especially during the blog era. Hip Hop DX is my favorite blog, my favorite publication of all time. And during the mid-2000s, when Andreas Hale was the editor-in-chief, Hip Hop DX was, the blogs were most prominent on Hip Hop DX. So you had great voices like Mecca from Two Dope Boys. You had great voices like Amanda Bassa. You had Andreas Hale. And then you had William Ketchum III with Speech is My Hammer. And I read that blog religiously. It inspired me to pick up the pen and continue to work on my own personal craft. Now he has spent a career being with Mic.com, with Vibe magazine, with Billboard, with the New York Times, one of the most noted pens in our space. William Ketchum III, 9-second applause.
Well, thanks for having me, man. As a viewer of your page, the 9-second applause is like rare air, man.
Word up. I appreciate it. Thank you. And then also the journalists, especially music journalists, broadly speaking journalism in general, on my Mount Rushmore. Unquestionably on my Mount Rushmore of hip-hop journalism. I've been inspired by his pen from his Rolling Stone work, inspired by his interviews, whether they were with Fuse or with BET, and then most inspired by how he's been able to take the hip-hop ethos into broader conversations on the cycle, for example, and in political spaces. And now he is one half of Rap Latte, taking his talents to the digital space. The legendary Toure, 9-second applause.
Thank you, Big Justin. Appreciate you.
Word up. Now, topic of the day, the state of music reviews. And I've been thinking about this from multiple angles over a few years, truthfully. At my time at Hip Hop DX, the album reviews were still a big traffic generator for the publication, especially when big albums came out. And so we still heavily leaned into those. And we leaned into those with a rating. We even made the rating more dynamic. We went from a 5-point scale to having 5 points in between, right? Because it meant something in the space to put a rating on a review and to let people know how you felt about it. And during my time at DX, we started seeing other publications start to refrain from even putting a rating on. They might do a commentary on it. They might write an essay about what the project was about. But it was the first time where I started seeing people sort of step away from the rating scale. In hip hop, the 5-mic rating at the source is the pantheon at a point in time. Double XLs meant quite a bit. Even, the 5-star system at Rolling Stone and various other publications. But somewhere in the mid-teens to late teens, you started seeing publications step back from putting a rating on it, move forward with more editorial focus. And as I learned then, because there were people who had real repercussions with sponsors and advertisers, if you have a label that is, spending ad dollars, and then you shit on their project, if there becomes a different type of balance. At the same time, we also have the onset of social media, of crowdsourced reviews. And we have the onset of people with great industry relationships that find ways to cater to fan bases. All kinds of things have happened with the review. But to me, at this point in time, the review seems, at least especially a review from a publication, from a noted voice, or from a perspective, or reviews with ratings, don't seem to be the driving force, in my opinion, behind whether or not a project is getting positive reviews or getting positive conversation around it. Am I off base? Let's start with you, Fantano. I mean, you've been doing this for a long time, and you've been in the digital space too.
I mean, I think, to echo everything that you said, also on top of that, a lot of music writers aren't getting the amount of work or the pay that they used to, at least in respect to like what the economics were 10 or 20 years ago. And it's becoming less and less worth it for them to sort of like put their own names and lives on the line, especially in an era where like, the hardcore stands of these fan bases have the ability to get in touch with them directly and harass them, which I've seen, by way of like, friends of mine. Oh, hey, I just had this random review go up. Oh, my first review on this publication. I've been trying to get it. It's not like the most positive review of like the new Miley Cyrus record. And that person ends up getting like docs the next day or some stuff like that, or sort of like, and again, it's not necessarily worth it. But I mean, I think it, whether or not an opinion of a record kind of like moves the needle in any one direction, it really just sort of matters how influential that person's voice may or may not be in a given space. But I mean, generally speaking, you're correct in that it does sort of seem like, for the most part, before a lot of the reviews that we see come out, the audience has more or less sort of like formed an opinion based on sort of like the consensus they see among themselves on social media immediately out of the gate, because especially for big records, like promos don't really go out like they used to prior to album releases. So you don't really have the opportunity for reviewers to sit on these records for weeks upon weeks upon weeks and like really think about what they're going to say. Everybody's reacting to the record all at once. Now, that's not to say that like at this point, it's still not worth doing and developing a review and an opinion around a new record that everybody's kind of like already heard or sort of put their 2 cents in already on the social media, front, because, I can't tell you how many albums at this point I've reviewed that the reception the record has seen out of the gate is vastly different than the reception the album continues to get 6 months later. I've had so many opinions, and it's not everyone, but I've had so many opinions that like maybe it's not the most positive and people kind of react a little negatively. And then like maybe 3 to 6 months later, people are like, actually the album was kind of underwhelming. And, Fantano wasn't entirely wrong. It's the reviews that people sort of continue to stay sort of in disagreement with that I hear about again and again and again and again, like maybe years later. The albums that actually do kind of like fall off and don't continue to hold people's attention long term are the ones that like they totally forget about what I even said about it in the first place.
Fantano's point about the pre-release listen time is really important. Back in the day when it was mainly publications, and maybe some blogs got this too, that they would send you the album, generally a cassette, later sometimes a CD, 2 to 3 weeks before the review was due. So yeah, you had time to sit and listen to it and understand it and think about it, and then present a review that was deeply thought of as everyone else was having their first listen. And yeah, in a world where there were publications that mattered, like the Source review mattered for a long time, it mattered. I remember hearing, just the example of Nas, I remember hearing about what he said on Live at the Barbecue, and then I heard that, and then the song, and then the next thing I heard was he got 5 mics in the Source. I think I heard that fact before I heard a single, and was like, oh well, we have to check this out because they gave him 5 mics. So that was a constant driver of wanting to pay attention to these sort of reviews. I don't think that exists at all anymore. I don't think there's any publication outside of Anthony that's big enough that a lot of people would really care about. Pitchfork was important, at least to me, to some people, but I think it was more niche than the Source was, than some other publications were. But as Anthony referenced, it becomes politically dangerous to be honest within reviews, album after album. You may love this album, you can say how great that album is. Eventually you're going to say this album is whack or it's meh. And then you're going to run into problems, especially, at Rolling Stone, we want to review you over here and not contact you and not talk to you, just review you. But then also, can we get an interview, for the album? And well, if you gave us a shitty review, like, what the fuck? I mean, I remember I wrote about Puffy's album where they had the song Bad Boy for Life with the Ben Stiller in the house video.
Right.
And in the review and in the song, he said, don't worry if I write rhymes, I write checks. As a hip hop purist, I found that insulting. I said in the review, this is something along the lines of, this is anti-hip hop, to say that, right? That's not what we do in hip hop. Overall, the review was like, this is a fine pop rap album, but like that line stuck out. But I wasn't like knives out, like stabbing him over it. He called me and cursed me out for maybe half an hour. And how could you say that about me? And blah, blah, blah. And I did interviews with him after that, but this is now we're getting to that he's psychotic. But like this sort of danger to the publication and to the journalist, 3 albums later, they're like, you dissed our second album, so we're not giving you an interview on the 5th album. That can happen. And I definitely realized after a certain point, reviewing is cutting down my opportunities to talk to people in the future. If I do an interview with you, you're probably going to be happy with it. If I do a review, 50-50, you're like, I don't like it and I don't want to talk to you in the future. So that becomes a problem. And it is potentially physically dangerous. I reviewed Public Enemy's 4th album, Music in Our Message. Was that 4th or 5th album, Music in Our Message?
I think
it was their first crappy album.
Yeah, I think it's their 5th album, if I'm not mistaken.
And the first line of the review was, I guess we should be used to seeing black heroes die in public. People, this is in Rolling Stone, people ran up on me on the street and in conferences and shit and listening. How could you say that about Public Enemy? I felt like the thing you feel when you say something in the comments or the retorts on Twitter are attacking you. I had that in real life. People from the group, from their fan base coming up in my face. How dare you say that about them? And I had to stand strong about the album sucks. What the fuck do you want from? I didn't make it. Don't be mad at me. But it was personally dangerous for me to say what I really felt.
Man, I mean, Ketchum, I'd love for you to chime in here. Have you had any situations between labels and fans, for example, editors maybe, or dangerous moments, I guess, when it comes to, your work with album reviews?
I reviewed J. Cole's A Sideline Story I think it was for Hip Hop DX, I think. And I was in college when the album came out, in my later years of college. And I was at a burrito spot late one night with my friends, and like somebody was ready to like physically confront me over me giving this album like I think I gave it a solid like a 3.0 out of 5.
I remember that review.
Yeah, and he was, like this person was really upset. I've had artists reach out to me about negative reviews. Some of them, and it's funny because often when the artist reaches out to me, I'm able to get like a little more context about the album. I've had artists reach out to me like, hey, I know the album sucked. This is why. I've had artists reach out to me like, hey, you know what? Like, I can understand why you like feel this way. It was, like some of what you said may have come across as pretty mean, but like, these are the scenarios that sort of made the album come out this way. I published a review of a Lupe record, Drogas Wave. I didn't write the review, but I was the editor for it. And Lupe hated the review, snapped on Twitter about it. Now, granted, this was a positive review. We love the album.
Just not enough.
Lupe wasn't crazy about the angle of the conversation that the review had. So we went back and forth on Twitter for a minute. His followers let me have it. And Lupe's like, yo, like, just give me your phone number. I called Lupe. We had an off the record conversation, and I've interviewed him like 3 times since then. Like, he's like one of my like favorite interviews now. So
was this when you were with Vibe? Is that where this was?
I was at Vibe. Yeah. Yep. The review was written by Andre G, one of the best journalists we have right now.
100%.
Yeah. And so all these things happen, but it reminds me of a conversation that Jamel Hill had recently, just about the confrontation between LeBron and Stephen A. Smith. And Jamel was like, that actually reminds me of a different era where it was like, if I was going to write about an athlete, you still had to see them the next day. And I kind of have that same like approach when I was like like writing reviews. It's like, even if I don't I mean, like I try not to use any language that I wouldn't say to their face. I try to be honest, and when they want to talk to me about it, I'm always down to have a conversation.
You know, I was thinking about this conversation. I was trying to remember when the golden era of album reviews was. Like, you know, just generally speaking, like what I would consider the golden era. You know, I'm heavily impacted by the late 80s to the late 90s, right? Excuse me. That's me going through adolescence and growing up, and these are things that I'm reading all the time, right? And so a lot of those reviews stand out to me more than perhaps some of the things that happened in the early 2000s or mid 2000s. Definitely some things that happened, you know, post Trump's election, we shall say, right? And so, and there was a point in time where Rolling Stone, Vibe, Double XL, and The Source, like all four of those really meant a lot at the same time. And so I look at that pocket as being, and then at the same time too, you had, you know, I think you had a lot of scale that was happening in the music industry behind a number of different labels. You had labels that were selling to the big three labels that we have now. I think that there was just a lot of investment in the space, and magazines at that time were chunky. I mean, you're talking magazines with all kinds of ad space in them and stuff. Like, do you guys have a particular era that inspired you to start writing album reviews? Do you have a particular era that you look at as like the golden era of that space?
Anthony, you go.
I mean, commercially and objectively speaking, the era that you just brought up is probably like the golden era, as it were. I mean, but for me personally, like a lot of what inspired me was just coming more from a place of radio. You know, I sort of like fell into album reviews accidentally. You know, like I was planning on sort of making a way for myself in the world of radio, and was working at an NPR station and was like the music director and general manager of my college radio station for several years, and you know, went on to sort of like do a music show at this local, you know, NPR affiliate that had recently gone from like just being an all classical station to an all talk station. So they were like repeating a lot of programming throughout the entire day because they were just starting to sort of gravitate into, you know, different formats. And I was like, well, what if I made a show? Would you play that? You know, what if I just made a show for free? Would you just like air it? And they were like, yeah, you know, like make it a podcast, show us you can do it for like a couple months without missing an episode, make it a certain time, and you know, we'll air it if you can show us that like you do it regularly and it's not terrible. So you know, I kind of met that very low bar and they started airing it. But like around that time and prior, a lot of what was influencing me, or like how I would get turned on to stuff, was like, you know, music that was coming in through the radio station, or stuff that my friends were talking about either on very small music blogs or live journals, or sort of like music conversations that I was catching on like local music forums at the time and stuff like that. And I didn't follow it super closely, but I was inspired by like what websites like Pitchfork were doing at the time in terms of like just forging a new way for music conversation on the internet, just outside of the magazine space in general. And, you know, just like kind of keeping a finger on the pulse of like some of the newer, hipper artists that like I personally and my friends were personally more interested in, you know, some of the more left field and underground artists at the time, you know, be it some of the indie acts, or be it, you know, rappers like MF Doom, who we were like really into around that era. And, you know, that was like sort of my launching pad, kind of like looking at music reviewing or music opinions from like more of a general discourse standpoint, maybe not in the sort of chaotic way that we see it now in the social media age, but like, you know, it was kind of like a more two-way, slower, thoughtful, kind of like big paragraph type of discourse going on in like, you know, different music forums and sort of blogs and stuff like that, that were like very small time around that time for me.
A lot of things that I found in the 80s as a reader, as coming up, I didn't start writing until the early 90s, was that a lot of great reviews weren't saying thumbs up, thumbs down. They were just explaining what it was. And as hip hop is developing through the mid 80s into the late 80s, it was really valuable to have people saying, this is representative of this. This samples, or this recalls Melly Mel, what he was doing in a previous generation. This is the Brooklyn style versus the Harlem style versus the Bronx style, these sort of things. So it wasn't always that I looked to the review to say, was it good or bad? But sometimes like, can you help me further understand what I'm listening to? And writers who were able to do that really had a big impact on me. Now, there's no reviewer, perhaps in the history of music, who is equivalent to Greg Tate. And if you aspire to be a reviewer or writer, or you just love this music, you should read Greg Tate. His first book was Flyboy and the Buttermilk. That's a collection of the essays that created his reputation. And quite often, the writing would evoke art the same way that the art that he's reviewing is artful. And he's writing about Eric B. and Rakim in a way that evokes a style that is Eric B. and Rakim-ish, but the style that he's coming with is equivalently interesting to the style that they're coming with. And, you know, his work was just extraordinary. I don't think anybody could ever catch up to the level of brilliance, style, and blackness that he's coming with on like every sentence. It was unbelievable.
First off, shout out to Greg Tate, RIP to him. Flyboy and the Buttermilk is like virtually impossible to find. I literally searched for years before I could find a physical copy, especially like since he passed away. I ended up getting this copy through like a crazy barter system. It was wild. You can find it digitally on the Internet Archive, but like you can't really download it. But shout out to Greg Tate. That book is incredible. If you can find Flyboy and the Buttermilk,
Worth it.
highly recommend it. It's incredible. The reviews that really inspired me, I was reading XXL and Vibe and The Source in the late 90s and early 2000s. And those were, you know, when I had the most, like, when there were the most reviewers who I really recognized by name, and I put a lot of like value in the actual publication. But the website rapreviews.com was a really big deal for me, because that's when I realized, that's when I felt that like album reviews were actually like accessible. I was seeing a lot of names that I didn't really recognize, seeing albums that I didn't really recognize. And that made me realize, it's like, oh, like this isn't just the big magazines that are on newsstands. This is something that's online, and this is something that you know, everybody can access. And in my freshman year at Michigan State, I ended up reaching out to the editor-in-chief. I'm like, hey, I want to write. I don't need to get paid yet, but I would love to just, you know, like write some album reviews. And that was the first site that I started writing for. And they've done a lot of great work as well.
Yeah, I look at the onset of the blog era in general, right? I mean, that's when you have a whole new wave of brand new voices that you get a chance to see how their style is, or their outlook, or their point of view on different projects is. But also you get volume, right? When you get to the blog era, one, as Fantano was talking about in the beginning, the economics dropped significantly. You know, I was getting like $60 a review, and I was happy with that $60. I was like, hey, that's a light bill. I just got a light bill, right? I was more interested in getting my name out there than I was about the money, but the economics dropped significantly. So you have so many more people who are now doing this, right? And so now you have a range of different albums that might not have made it into The Source or XXL or Rolling Stone, right? That are now getting looks. And you about to say something, Toure? I thought you about to say.
Well, no, I mean, you're referencing the old school publications, which is cool, but because there were a few of them, we could write about a wide array of artists. And because you already opened Rolling Stone, I could review Big X the Plug, which you might not have opened. Like if I just offered you that, like just click on this, you wouldn't. But because you're already in Rolling Stone, you're already reading the review of the hot new Snoop album. Okay, I'll read this too. But in the modern era online, I think, with the exception of Fantano, you gotta keep it to the big things that they're already checking for. If I do a review of some small thing, not that many people are going to click on it. If I do a review on, some shitty songs for you, we're going to get a big number. You know what I mean? Like, so the moving to the internet from the magazine conversation, the number of things that you can reasonably review and get a big audience for are very small.
I think it depends on the audience's fan base more than anything else, right? Because one thing that happened with Hip Hop DX that I didn't really see anywhere else in the space was they were willing to review strange music. They would review Tech Nine and all those guys. They weren't getting no burn anywhere else. They were an independent, label. And the Tech Nine audience was massive and cohesive. And I look at those examples as, sort of the beginning of that power of the fan base just showing up. One of the things that we started first experiencing with the blog era. And I think you can do that now to a certain degree with certain audiences, with artists that might not seem that big, but if you tap into their audience, then you could have an outside success. Fantano, I think you're an institution at this point in time now, right? So maybe there's just a baseline that anything's going to do because people rock with you in that regard. But how do you, for example, consider what's worthy of a review, what's not worthy of a review?
I mean, I do think to a certain extent, like what Toure is saying is true. I'm even seeing a little bit of it to an extent, but I think, it used to be, and I don't know if this is just like the algorithms or sort of like, my shifting, changing audience or just sort of like the way my brand has evolved over the years. But like there used to be more of a general consistency across all of my reviews in terms of like viewership engagement, whether it was like a smaller review or whether it was like a big review. Especially if it was something that if it was more obscure, I had like the yellow flannel in the video, which I used to signify to people like, I like this a lot. And these days, there's like definitely way more of a gap. Like the bigger reviews tend to get more traffic faster and like hit the big numbers and hit the higher numbers in sort of like a shorter span of time. Whereas like the smaller reviews kind of struggle. However, I still see it. There's like a decent amount of like music discovery and stuff like that going on, but I don't know if it's happening on YouTube as much as it's happening on TikTok these days and places like that. I think like a lot of younger listeners who are looking for something new are stumbling across new things that they're finding out about on TikTok as opposed to sort of like, scrambling around YouTube and having, people like me decide for them what they should be listening to a lot of the time. I need to sort of like find out different approaches and formats when it comes to sort of like maybe more curating and taste making. And I think that's like more on me. I think that's me having to sort of like adapt to the situation and having to figure out different ways of sort of introducing people to new things versus reviewing something that they've already heard and they're looking for like a second sort of lengthier in-depth opinion on. I think things have changed in such a way to where introducing people to things, it may require a different approach from me than telling them what they maybe should or shouldn't think about a particular record that's just come out that maybe there's a lot of anticipation behind.
Part of the thing you live for as a reviewer is to get the big thing, the big album that you can say, this is amazing. And you like can trumpet like how brilliant this is.
Yeah, you want to put people onto stuff. I feel like if you're just commentating and you're not curating, you're just kind of doing half the job.
Yeah. But you also need eventually to have that you call it a brick, or you could call it like, a horror movie where you slash somebody. This album actually sucks. And you there really do, going back to what we said before about courage, you do see a separation of the men and the boys to the people who'll be like, this album could have been better versus the people who are like, this album is horrible. And they're right. And they're not overstoking it. For me, for the most part, I feel like I have to be out of all of that. Because when I was 25, 30, even 35, in clubs, in conversation with the heads on a daily basis. And when I was 30, I have no problem saying your album sucks. And I will stand nose to nose. I am the culture. Fuck you. You're wrong. I don't care that you were at Chung King all night long. Your album sucks. I liked your last album. I like your genre. I like your subgenre. This is you missed it. And I'm right. I'm right in the middle of the culture to be able to say, no, you missed it. At this point, if I didn't like it, I would be like, that's probably on me, dog. I need to do some more research. I need to catch up with what the kids are about. I'm not bricking anything. If I hated it, I would probably say it's not for me.
Do you remember a review that you might have bricked back then when you were at your most arrogance?
Oh, well, the Public Enemy brick was hard, and you knew it was hard. We all looked at it, like, I mean, my editor looked at me like, are you sure you want to do this? And I mean, I was like, fuck yeah. Like, we're riding on them motherfuckers. They ruined this was my favorite group. And you came out with a super brick. And I forget who else, some other known writer then also, he didn't go as hard as me emotionally in the review, but he also was like, this album is not it. There was like 3 critical reviews, and one was like, this is meh. And he was like trying to dodge the bullet. And then me and I forget who, me and one other guy were like, this album sucks. And I was like, I feel comfortable doing that I felt super comfortable. I had to remember something else that I really bricked. But you definitely learn over time. It really does hurt the artist's feeling. You know what? When I was super young, I think this is my second actual artist interview. I think I didn't like one of the Jungle Brothers albums, and I was interviewing them, and I said I didn't like that album. I can't remember what it was, because sitting here now, I'm like, I love the first album, I love the second album, I don't know what it was. But I told them to their face, I didn't like such and such. And I didn't realize you can't say that. And later I realized they got very emotional and kind of left the conversation for a moment. And the manager stepped in and picked up the conversation so that I wouldn't realize, that they were upset with me, and they reset and we got back into it. In the moment, I didn't realize what was happening. I was only like 25 years old, so I didn't understand what was happening. And later I was like, oh, and like, oh my God, they get so sensitive. The least little, this song should have had a higher key. Oh my God, they're so upset. So you have to.
You know what's interesting about that? Like, you can tell them that you love all of the other albums, right? But if you mention the one album that you dislike, that's probably the album that they're the most sensitive about. So if you say that you dislike the album that like everybody else loves, it's like, oh shit, like fuck you, like everyone else loves this, it's fine. But if you can tap into it, tap into the album that they're the most sensitive about, then like that's gonna have a different reaction.
I mean, the thing you said before about an artist calling you and saying, that album wasn't all that. I don't know. I don't know. I need some more receipts, because I don't know. They think everything they make is incredible. I know they understand. I had a deadline. We had to send it out the door. I would have liked to fuck with it for another week, a month, whatever. But like, they think their babies don't make no mistakes, and you got to come in here and be like, because if you don't say this album is meh, and if the audience says their album was whack and you didn't say that, then that's on your reputation.
Absolutely.
And that's critical to have you don't have to mirror the audience, but the audience has to respect your opinion. Okay, Anthony liked it. I see how he did. Because if there's too much dissonance between what they think and what you think, then they don't respect you. They don't trust you.
Open question, everybody. In 2025, is the album review necessary?
No.
Yes.
I would say to the degree that the album is necessary, but the thing is, these days, I even question the necessity of the album in terms of like, as much as I love the format, what is really holding us to it at this point? Like it's not like people have to listen to music in this way. And like some of the biggest and most sort of like talked about rap releases, like, the Playboi Carti album, for example, or even like the latest Ice Spice album. To me, both of those records say like, we don't really give a shit about the album as a format. One is like barely enough songs to make an album. And the other one is like, we're just going to pack as many songs into the album as possible, just because we don't really know what off this record people are going to like. people aren't going to like, what's going to hit, what's not going to hit. So we're just going to basically shotgun blast a million tracks at you and just leave it up to the audience to decide like what's actually relevant and what's not, which to me isn't like that does not an album make, you know, like, so I mean, you know, it still kind of counts in a way as like a body of work. And, you know, at the end of the day, like there isn't necessarily a better alternative to artists releasing tracks in this way, because I mean, the moment that you come out with any amount of music that people like, they instantly want more, you know, and what are you going to do other than within a certain era, give them more of that same sort of sound and idea and so on and so forth, and kind of packaging a certain sound or idea or era within the confines of an album just right now makes the most sense. But like these days, the majority of casual music listeners aren't experiencing music through the album format day to day. They're listening to playlists, they're listening to their favorite tracks, they're experiencing a lot of different songs and snippets on platforms like TikTok and other places where they're not even listening to full fucking songs. So, you know, I think the album format is still there. It's still around for the artists who actually really care about it and the heads who are passionate about it. I mean, in this era where it sort of seems like in some respects the album is dead, I still hear artists all the time making great albums that are like really cohesive and thoughtful and passionate and some of the best the album format has had to offer. But, you know, it still doesn't change the fact that like it's still not the way most people are experiencing music these days.
It's not the way you said the first time you said casual. It's not the way most casuals are experiencing music for sure. But people who love a certain genre are paying attention to when do the stars or the new folks dropping albums and focusing our listening attention around albums.
But I guess here's my question: is that, I mean, you know, I think most music listeners love albums, but are those albums more of this era than a past era? And are those artists excited for those albums because of like what the album is, or maybe what it used to mean at a certain point in time? Or are they more excited for that project because it just means more songs from an artist that they like?
I mean, hopefully, you know, hopefully an album speaks to who you are at this point in your artistic development.
That's what we would hope.
That's what you would hope, right? And hopefully,
but the question is like, what does the audience want? What is the audience hoping for from like a sexy songs for you? You know, are they thinking like, oh, this is like Drake in a certain mode, a certain era, or is this like, oh, just new songs from the boy?
Well, I think it really like depends on the artist, though. You know, like if we hear that a Kendrick album is coming out, we're interested in hearing the grand statement that he's going to make.
Yes.
If it's going to be like a release for Drake, I mean, the Drake record is literally called "Some Sexy Songs for You." You know what I mean? It's like it's like the Drake record.
The name for it?
Say what?
I thought it was called "Some Shitty Songs for You." That's what we called it. On the whole,
1 second applause.
We made a mistake. That was a mistake. That's my bad. I want to apologize to my people.
But I mean, you know, like, but there are definitely some artists who literally just look at the album as like a collection of songs, right? And I think that, but I do think that there are specific artists who are going to use an album as a statement and as sort of like a representation of where they're at. Although
it depends on what they set their audience up for. I think Drake has been in that mode for a decade now. I think he's more or less been in that mode when it comes to approaching albums since More Life. Because I mean, if we remember, that was a playlist.
Yep. Yeah.
that wasn't an album. And I think he's mostly been kind of like thinking of his albums format wise in that same way since then, because he came out with that fucking thing and it was well received. His fans liked it. You know, because I don't think Drake fans are sort of like expecting the kind of storytelling and world building that maybe some fans of other artists who tend to indulge in that sort of thing do on their albums, respectively.
I mean, to get back to your question, it's about reviews. Are reviews helping fans understand these albums better, put them in context better?
I think that depends on the effort that you put in, because like what you were saying earlier, I think more importantly than just saying whether or not a thing is good or bad, and it is valuable to communicate to the viewer whether or not a certain thing is worth their time in an age where things are so saturated. A review should bring context.
Yeah, and that's an important thing. Context is everything.
And that's important. Whether you're talking about Kendrick, where obviously, you know, we're all going to love diving into the story of that and so on and so forth. But I think it's also like incredibly essential when reviewing Sexy Red, because I feel like, especially with, someone like her, where I've caught a lot of flack in the past for like saying I like a lot of her tracks and I like her music. There are a lot of people who hate on her and get down on her while simultaneously completely ignoring the fact that, like, content wise, aesthetically, energy wise, like, she's bringing a lot to the table that like Gucci Mane used to back in the day, and like Waka Flocka did out of the gate. And the thing is, like, a lot of the people that hate her and despise her don't really understand that context, or sort of, for whatever reason, are not able to sort of like see her music as operating in pretty much the same lane. And I feel like if they were able to at least a little bit see it in that context, she literally tells you she's the female Gucci Mane, they would sort of see where she's coming from a little bit more, even though I do think a lot of her antics and trolling kind of overshadow her music sometimes. She's very kind of consciously engaging in that. But when I do hear a lot of people talking about her positively or negatively, I don't often hear that brought up as much as I should in terms of like an influence, because, there is a context for what she does, whether you enjoy it or not.
The notion of context, the notion of context is really important. That if I'm going to review Sexy Red, I at least want to think about her relationship to other people from her city, other people in her era, other people in her subgenre, other women rappers, so that if I need to, I will put in context of any number of these different groups that she's attached to, so you understand a little bit better where she's coming from and what she's trying to do because of the group she's coming in from. Again, not just demographically, but also sonically, also geographically. There's so many ways to contextualize the project and the artist so that the audience will understand a little bit better what they're trying to do.
And I think
that doesn't always necessarily need to be a positive thing. You could bring up so-called influences and, the sort of background within a certain work of art operates in, to say, like, this is actually much weaker than sort of like the classics or the mainstays that we know to sort of be in this genre operating with this sound.
But go ahead, Ketchum.
I'm sorry. To me, it's musical context, real world context. Both of those things are what's like most important. Like, if you're gonna like write a review for like D'Angelo's Black Messiah, you're gonna talk about how that was sort of like, how that came out during a certain time in the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Like if you don't bring up the real world context,
sure,
like you're missing the most important part of that album, honestly. So to me, it's always real world context and musical context, whether it's context with their peers, whether it's context with, other artists in that genre from like decades prior or at the same time. To me, so like that's why I said yes when you asked if the album review was still, it's still a necessary format. I don't think that that context is being captured as well outside of album reviews.
And perhaps there's a distinction between the album review and an album review with a rating, right? Toure, you gave a great example in the 80s and 90s where you just had people explain what the album is, and then the rating became more important later. I think maybe there's a distinction there.
At this point, I find a rating to be a really crass and impossible thing to do. How do I even put Sexy Red in the same sort of category that Kendrick would be in? If Kendrick gets a 5, then is Sexy stuck at a 3 or a 4 or how does she also get a 5? Because she could get a 5 if I just look at her. Like, did she do everything that she tried to do with this project? If the answer is yes, and she's making the clubs, jump, that could be a 5. But Kendrick is over here with triple entendres that you have to have a dictionary out to understand. You can't. So then a numerical rating makes no sense to me whatsoever. And it's sort of an insult to the projects. If I need to be able to explain with words, this is what I think about something. It's a valuable marketing tool as far as I got 5 mics in the Source, or I got 5, what did we do? 5 stars in Rolling Stone or whatever. It would be very politicized. It was much harder for a great hip hop album from a contemporary artist who maybe some of the boomers didn't know. For that to get a 5-star review, even though the review read like a 5-star review, but Bob Dylan or Rolling Stone or Mick Jagger or somebody who's a friend of the boss comes through with their 27th album and that gets 5 stars. Is that really a 5-star album? I don't think so. But I want to hear Anthony talk about this, because for me, adding the sociological context was easy. That was, I could look at an artist and understand like, oh, okay, this is what they're doing and this is what this album, but you also had, at least in the Rolling Stone reviews that you also had to take at least a moment and describe what it sounds like. And that was always the hardest thing for me. Just describe what, without judgment, thumbs up, thumbs down, just this is what it sounds like. And you could get away with maybe a sentence of it, but like 3 or 4 sentences just describe. That's really hard to do. Like, it's different than the sociological import of it, but just it's hard. I don't know if that was easy for you and other parts were harder for you, or if there was one part of the exercise that like, this is the tricky part for me.
That's my favorite part, describing what I think it sounds like. Describing like the textures of the instruments and so on and so forth. I mean, to me, that's like the most interesting bit. I guess that part comes more naturally for me than sort of like, and this is regardless of genre, than sort of like diving into the lyrics and trying to, re-explain what the artist is explaining. Even if I sort of read it and I'm like, I can understand sort of like in one simple pass, like what exactly they're trying to get across. But like, obviously you have to do it because you want to tell the audience what they're in for and what's being communicated to them. But, I try not to sort of like speak for the artist per se. I try to be as straightforward as possible and not maybe take too many kind of crazy liberal interpretations. And if I am doing that, like explicitly say like, this is just my interpretation, but it seems like they're saying this and referencing this, and trying to get this across. Obviously like I also, will sort of like go back to what you said and probably because, just the nature of what I do, like I disagree on the score front. I mean, it can be crass for sure. And, it's like I've definitely engaged in that crassness, but I don't see the score so much as a categorization as much as I see it as just a reflection of my raw enjoyment. And that's it. And I can enjoy both Sexy Red and any number of artists at an 8 level, but it depends on like, but as a reviewer, I feel like it's on me to sort of like have the capacity to enjoy different things for different reasons and then bolster my arguments and explain why exactly that is.
I think also
like just because I score two different albums, this may be the same score, it doesn't mean I'm enjoying them the same way or getting the same thing out of them. I could just be enjoying the hell out of the both of them, but just for different reasons.
Sometimes the number codifier or quantifier stops people from listening, shuts them down from listening.
I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that.
Well, now we see the numbers existing even outside the review. As soon as you go to whatever streaming service you go to, there's the number of stars that's sitting right there. I mean, I've talked to a number of young people who say, when I ask them how they find out about new music or how they know if an album is good when they're checking something out, and a lot of them say, I go to the playlist or I go to the album, I look at the songs with the most number of stars, and if there's not a whole lot of 5 stars on there, I just think it's trash and I move on. So a lot of the review process has been outsourced to streaming and to the algorithm or to an analytical side of these platforms now.
That partly explains why you get a lot of skip culture or whatever. A lot of people define, is an album good or not based on the number of skips, which to me is an insane way of judging an album, because a song you don't like might be liked by somebody else. And if somebody has a large fan base like a Beyonce or a Taylor, there's probably a wide array of tastes within that. So the 6 songs of Beyonce's album that you like and you don't like these 6, somebody else likes those 6 and doesn't like the 6 you. So she pleased both of you, but you're going, there's 6 skips here. I look at it more like, because like coming from, being exposed to an album through 1, 2, 3 singles, whatever. I start with, if you have a great song that's interesting to me, I want to listen to the rest of what you got. If you only gave me one great song, you gave me one great song. It's not like 1 up and 9 down. You had 9 more chances to score and you just didn't, but you scored 1. Nothing takes away from you. You had 1 incredible record on that. Yeah, when I spent my allowance on LL Cool J, what was it, his 3rd album, Walking with a Panther? Was that the 3rd one? Yeah, with Veronica Webb on the back.
Right.
And the album was whack. I think there was maybe one song, and I spent my allowance on that shit. Like, and I was pissed. I get it, but like, I want to focus more on like, oh my God, you made 1 or 2 or 3 great songs rather than you gave me 6 skips or whatever the fuck.
See, I'm on the other side of that. You know, I love skip culture. You know, I put a heavy weight on skips because to me, how good is a song if I don't want to listen to it? You know, I know that there's variations in that. It might be an amazing art piece in itself, but I grew up cutting the grass. And if I was listening to a CD and I was cutting the grass and I couldn't get through the yard without having a Goody Mob World Party. Goody Mob World Party. I think that's their 3rd album, right? That is the ultimate. That album is the ultimate example of craptastic and underwhelming to me because I couldn't make it through cutting the grass. If I'm pressing skip too much, how good is it really? I mean, there's like Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers is an example of skip culture to me when I look at this album. Like, I could look at it and say it's a masterpiece, right? I can look at all the things he does. But at the same time, I'm skipping like 5, 6 songs on an 18-song project. How good is an album if you don't want to listen to it?
He gives you 5 songs, which is a lot. 5 great songs is a lot. He or she gives you 5 songs that you can't stop listening to, and you keep coming back to them over and over and over, and you don't want to listen to the other 12. That's a success. That's
to me. That is a D-.
5 out of
that's half the project. Why do I need half the project?
5 out of 17. I don't know, G. So like, but it's also interesting because like there can be songs that are like a skip quality wise, but not a skip narratively.
Right. Or a song that's like too powerful. Like, you know, like We Cry Together is a song that I just think is
absolutely.
Yeah, you're not always in the mood for it.
Right. It's a great song. I love it. But if you have an album that has 18 songs and 5 to 6 of them are like that, how good is any album if you only like 2/3 of it?
I think it depends on what is the reason for the skip. Are you skipping the song just because like it's too powerful
100%.
and you're just not in the mood for it right now? Or are you skipping it because it's trash and you're just never going to listen to it in any context? Like, you know, to me,
right. Yeah.
That's truly what a skip is. You know, some stuff, you know, I can appreciate that a piece of art can be great while simultaneously not being something that I'm always going to be in the mood for all the time, especially in the context of like what you were just talking about. Like if I'm doing something else and I'm kind of putting the music on, which is totally fine, to sort of like just accompany something else that I'm doing. Yeah, you know, it's like, it's great to always have time to sort of just sit down and just interact with the music directly and have nothing else going on. But you know, the beauty of music is that you can do it while other stuff is happening too, you know, and the thing is there's some music that doesn't necessarily lend itself to that kind of sort of, you know, context.
But let's give them a little look into your process. And I'll give you just a brief into my process of like, when I review something or when I reviewed something, it was never a secondary thing, right? I'm listening to it while doing nothing else multiple times, reading the lyrics while I'm listening to it, thinking about their previous albums and where they sit in terms of the culture. Like, because some people, you like, you know, you give them a bad review and they're like, you didn't listen to the album enough. And I'm like, I listened to the album. I give you a shit ton of undivided attention. I'm sure, Anthony, when you're queuing up to do a review, you're going to give them a ton of undivided attention.
I mean, that's my goal. I mean, you know, I'm focusing on exactly a lot of the things that you just said. I mean, the album review I just put up of the new Imperial Triumphant album in the last 24 hours. I mean, that involved sort of like, you know, going over a new record from a band that has 5 or 6 past albums. They've been making records for the past decade plus. The record itself is like this big kind of concept album about wealth inequity and weirdly ties in with like old cigarette ads from, like the Depression era and stuff like that. Like, I try to do my best to sort of like focus on what is the story the artist is telling, if they are even in fact trying to do that, or, even just like build a record around a sound and, try to, again, analyze the lyrics if they're really trying to sort of like, if they're even an artist that emphasizes, sort of like a focus or, the quality of the lyrics, as some artists like aren't as lyrical as others. I'm just trying to sort of like digest the album and listen to it multiple times over and just kind of pick out what stands out to me, what doesn't, for both good and bad reasons. I think I sort of like echo your sentiments earlier in terms of like, if there's a certain number of tracks from a project that I've enjoyed, like if half the songs are fantastic to me or I keep coming back to them, but the rest are just okay, I could see myself landing at like a 6 or a 7 out of 10 on that project. And for me, anything above a 5 is like vaguely or very positive. So, the thing is, there are lots of 7 out of 10 albums that I find myself coming back to tracks from over and over and over. And just because something's a 7 out of 10 doesn't mean it's like terrible or like I've suddenly like lost all faith in the artist and so on and so forth and never want to hear their music again. There's just like a bunch of tracks on there I like. There's a bunch that I don't. And, in regards to a review, I just try to do my best to sort of justify what it is I am enjoying and what's standing out to me about the album as being supremely good or impressive and what is kind of falling short.
What's your process, Ketchum?
I try to listen through different context. I'll give it I'll give it multiple listens where I'm just sitting down at my computer, not doing anything. I'll give it a listen while I'm walking. I'll give it a listen while I'm driving, when I used to drive before I moved to New York City. I'll listen on the train. I'll listen while working out. And like that can be really helpful. Like Kendrick's GNX album, for example, I wasn't really crazy about it while I'm just like sitting at my desk, right? But like if I'm listening to it while I'm cleaning up the house, if I'm listening to it while I'm on the train, it's like, wow, like motion really helps, like the direction of this album.
My process has evolved over the years. I used to be very regimented when I first started writing things. I had a 10-point scale and I thought about all of them and the album based on every category within that 10-point scale. I'm a big proponent of looking at things from how useful as an album at the same time. Because again, it's like there is a balance to me between art and utility, right? Music is art, of course, but there is a utility to it. There is an escapism that people go to music for, or a level of inspiration, or, to help get through hard times or work or celebrate or whatever it is, right? And so, to use the sexy red analogy, right? She gonna go up in the club. She might not go up, when you're feeling meditative, but she gonna go up when you go outside. Right, so I always look at like the 5-tool album. Like, can you smoke to it? Can you work out to it in the gym? Can you drive to it? Can you clean the house to it? Can you drive to it? Can you downshift into Mac mode and smack bellies to it?
Can you dance to it?
Right.
That was
Yeah, it's the club. Yeah, that's the club one. Right. I mean, if you can do those things, and there's some songs and some albums that you could actually do all those things too, even if those things are contradicting. And that to me is just a different level. Like if you look at a 5-tool song, like a song like Dove's Cry is a 5-tool song to me. Like there isn't a place where that song really doesn't work in my life, right? Flashing Lights by Kanye West is a 5-tool song. And there's been albums that represent that, and from my point of view. And so that's just a different echelon. Now, from a rating standpoint, that's always a different thing. And a lot of times, most of my ratings were under while I was with the publication. And that's usually rating by committee for one reason or another. But I'll always look at the art of it and the utility of it. And those are my two most prominent things. Yeah. Like, where does this work and why?
By the way, to go back to the Skip conversation, Eminem's Kim.
Skip.
The song does exactly what it set out to do.
Right.
I skip it every time. I can't do it.
Every time. for each, I want, this is really great. I appreciate this. I want to wrap this up pretty soon. I don't want to take too much of you guys' time here, but like, you know, I'm very curious if you guys have in a review that you've done at any point in time where you look back and you're like, yeah, I nailed it. And if you have another review that you've done at different points in time where you're like, I wish I could take that one back. That one didn't age too well.
Oh my God. I think it might have been my third review. I reviewed Wu-Tang's first album and I was like, there's too many people on here. It's so confusing. How do I know who to listen to and who's talking at any given moment? There's 9 of them. Streamline this thing. Oh my God. If I could scrub that from the internet. Thank God nobody brings that up. As Anthony has an issue, people are like, oh, Anthony said this about this and that. But people don't do that to me. So thank God, because you totally could. If there's any other huge misses from me, I mean, I did, what was it? I did Janet Jackson's big album. It was Control, and then it was Rhythm Nation. And then what was the one after Rhythm Nation?
Is that Janet?
Yeah.
No, Velvet Rope. It's Velvet Rope, right?
No, I reviewed Janet.
Okay.
In Rolling Stone, and they gave me it was a double box. It was a huge deal. So instead of a 500-word review, it was an 800-word review. And instead of it appearing like this, it was like this. And I think I just was exuberant about the album, and I understood the whole vibe, and I explained it in a really clear and enthusiastic way. And it was definitely a stepping stone moment in my career in terms of a lot of people at my publication, Rolling Stone, and other publications were like, oh shit, that was really, like, he wrote the fuck out of that. Like, let's see what else he can do. So not really thinking about it on the musical side, but on the career side, that was a big review for me.
Ketchum, what you got?
The album review that I nailed was the review of Ye by Kanye West. I reviewed it for Double XL, and the idea that I had going into it was like, we often think of how these like traumatic experiences for artists often end up making the best art, right? So if an artist goes through a breakup, it's like, oh shit, like the next album gonna be crazy. Oh, like if this artist dealt with a death in the family, this is good, this is gonna be crazy. But the point that I was making about Ye was like, sometimes these artists go through shit and the album suffers because they don't know how to really process what they're dealing with. So I thought that I nailed that review, and I think it was like it was a harbinger for where his career would go after that point, kind of based on the issue that I brought up there. An album that I will forever regret is my Hip Hop DX review for Mos Def's The Ecstatic.
Oh my God, I remember that one now.
This is the thing. I didn't shit on the album. I didn't shit on it. I gave it a 3.5.
Which is a high rating, all things considered, especially out of 5.
I was talking to Jake Payne, shout out to Jake Payne, and I was like, listen, this album is a 3.5 to me now, but it's going to be a 4 or higher to me within the next 2 months, but I don't know why. And I can't explain how it's going to be a 4 or higher yet, but I know it's going to be.
So why didn't you give it a 4?
Because I couldn't articulate what made it higher than like what it was at the time.
That sounds like a super fan perspective right there. Like, I know I'm gonna like it because I love this artist so much.
I don't understand how you're gonna like it more, but you didn't lean into that. I'm like, all right, well, I'll give you the 4 since I know I'm gonna get there.
I wasn't able to explain it as well as I wanted to, I guess, right, at that time.
I remember that review too, because I think you did a blog about it after you wrote the review, and you were talking about how, or maybe you talked about it on social media, but I think one of the things that you critiqued yourself on was that you felt like it was more of a comparison to his previous work.
Yes.
The way you wrote it.
He released it on the anniversary of Black on Both Sides.
Right.
And you know, I was like, okay, maybe I'm comparing it too much to that, even if the release date was intentional, right? And I think that and you know, like even though the new Danger and I mean, like even though the new Danger sort of showed a different direction that he was taking, I don't know. I just felt like it was going to take me longer to really process how great the album was. I liked it the whole time. I didn't love it until later.
Right.
So I'm like, fuck, like if I can't justify how it's going to be and you know, like what's going to make it better, then you know, like I guess I just got to give it this 3.5 now.
Did you have editorial pressure?
But that's what
on
Jake
that?
said. Say what?
Yeah. Did you have editorial pressure on that? You said that's what Jake said. Okay.
Well, Jake was basically like, hey, like if you can't lay out the 4, then we got to do the 3.5.
Right. And DX was stingy. DX was stingy. DX in that era was very stingy too.
Yeah, and that is now my favorite album. I mean, like album of his now.
Wow.
And it just breaks my heart, man. That is my favorite album. It's my favorite album of his and one of my favorite albums ever.
Wow.
And,
All right, let's make a clip for the internet. What does Anthony regret?
I think my most recent one, and I mean, I have the joy of being control in my platform in a way where when I do have like a big enough of a regret, I actually can come onto my YouTube channel and be like, hey guys, like, look, I'm literally gonna re-review this now.
Yeah. A lot of magazines did that too.
Do the whole thing. And the most recent example of that was Mac Miller with Swimming. That record, I was brutally harsh on it out of the gate. Much in the same way that I was on Divine Feminine. During that era at first, I didn't really like the woozier, spacier production. I wasn't really into him sort of like leaning more into sort of like this very kind of low-key, sleepy singing style that he was doing. Obviously, he wasn't doing it to the same degree as he was on Swimming. And, you know, I just sort of, in the context of that album's original release, and I don't think I was alone in this, there's a lot of people that sort of like jumped down my throat over that review who, you know, they themselves sort of like either from their own minds or sort of like will ignore the immediate history of the album's release, being that a lot of people are like, it's okay, you know, it's all right, it's not mind-blowing. But then he passed away. And with my review being one of the biggest that were out there, like, people were flipping fucking shit nonstop. Like, there were fans who were in my DMs going as crazy as to be like, you fucking killed him. He's dead because of you. He probably saw your review and got really upset. And it's like, bro, chill the fuck out. I don't think this man was holding on by a thread, and my review was like the last thing he saw. And he's like, it's over. You know, I'm sure he had bigger things going on in his life than my opinions about his music. You know, and to say such a thing like displays a vast ignorance to how multifaceted and dynamic of a person he was. He actually had messaged me in the past, like around when I did my review of his Blue Slide Park album, which, I mean, at the time, like, he sort of knew why a lot of fans reacted to it negatively because it was way poppier and more commercial than like his mixtapes up until that point. And for the most part, he took the review in stride, you know, and seemed like pretty chill about the whole thing.
Wait, is that the one that most bugs you out of the things that, because there's a couple things that people chirp about, maybe you're like, I don't care about any of those. Is that
I would say that one did bug me quite a bit because I did sort of like, after all of that, you know, negativity, when a bulk of it sort of like calmed down, I think like, you know, 5+ years later, I did like have a conversation with some friends of mine who are genuinely into his music. And I was kind of like, you know, I trust your taste. I know you're a fan of him in that album. Why do you like it? You know, and then I actually like heard them out as opposed to sort of like listening to people just kind of fly off the fucking handle online. And then they were like, oh, you know, it's this reason and that reason, and I'm really into it, you know, and these are my favorite tracks. And I was like, okay, let me listen to those and try to like get back into it without thinking about it in the context of like, oh, I like Good AM more, and oh, I like Faces more, and I don't really like this low-key vibe that he's going for. And then also understanding better on top of that, sort of like what emotionally and mentally he was obviously going through around the time of that album. Also keep in context, when I did my re-review of the record and scored it much higher, I had also reviewed and heard Circles, which I loved when that came out. So, that obviously also added to the context of how I felt about the record at the time too. But yeah, I would say that like in terms of like recent instances, is the review that was bugging me so much up until a point where I felt I had to re-review it and just really kind of do a 180 on my opinion with it.
Wow. I have there's two interviews that really stand out, or reviews rather, that stand out to me. One is I reviewed Yeezus, and at that time it's probably Ye's most polarizing project. But I was editor-in-chief.
People forget that.
People forget it, right? And
it was one of his most polarizing. I mean, he's had multiple polarizing projects, but that album was polarizing upon release, and a lot of people just kind of see it now as like, oh yeah, it's one of his best. But it's like people were debating about it endlessly,
and especially because like 808s was polarizing in a different way. Like this one was like totally different. But I was editor-in-chief of DX at that point in time, and I had the review, and so I asked the staff what they thought. Right, because I liked it a lot. And so in our editorial meeting, we were talking about ratings. And everybody was like 3.5. And I was like, we can't give this a 3.5. Right, we're either giving this. So I took what everyone said, and I was like, okay, if they're giving it a 3.5 and I like it, I'm giving it a 4.5. Right, so I gave it a 4.5. It's one of my favorite reviews I ever wrote. And I got drilled in the comment section. I got drilled for praising that album for the first 18 months. And then ever since then, people look at that project so much more favorably. And in the years following that review, I was watching the rating improve on that same review, because the review went really viral too. So I love that one because I took a risk there, and it ended up being the right risk. But I'm a big proponent of, with certain projects from certain artists, if they're outside of what they do, we either go really high because we like the risk that they're taking, or we go really low because they lost themselves. I don't think it makes a difference to play the middle on something like Yeezus at that point in time. So that one worked out. And the regret I have is my To Pimp a Butterfly review, which I had too. Now I gave it a 5. I got the rating right, but I'm very disappointed in myself in how I wrote it. And the album I think it was a surprise drop. South by Southwest was happening that same week. In the internet era with reviews, you have like basically 2 days to figure it out and write about it. Here's this brawling, onion worth of layers to pull out of this project. My Good Kid, Mad City review at that point in time was the most read review in Hip Hop DX history, and I got that one right. And so there was a lot of pressure on me, and I had to fly to South by Southwest, or to South by Southwest, yeah. And so I'm writing this on a plane. I'm trying to get it up fast to hit the deadline. I check into my hotel, I finish it off, I publish it, and I just had to take my eyes away from it for, half a day or so, and I came back, and it was like grammatical errors in it and shit. Like it was written very quickly, right? But nobody noticed because the rating was right. So in both those situations, it was, to the audience, it was less about the prose in the conversation and all about the rating. And that to me was a turning point in how I started looking at what was happening in the album review space overall. Because there are a lot of places at that same point in time stopped putting ratings on things altogether. And so I think it's really interesting to see and feel, truthfully, the evolution of the album review from the time when we were all inspired to where we are now. Even down to the question of whether it's relevant. We got a yes, we got a no, and we got broader context. And I think that kind of speaks to where the medium and communication around albums and projects is now. And to a degree, I think it tosses back to what you described in the beginning, Toure, where people just wanted context, and maybe the rating wasn't important. But the rating is how you trigger people, and that's how you go viral.
I think I don't think the album review and the album review format is dead per se, but it just has a lot of competition now. There's, regardless of whether or not the album review is relevant, what's important is that music opinions are relevant. There's no shortage of music opinions on the internet now. There's music opinions everywhere. There's people stumbling over themselves to give music opinions and read other people's music opinions. It's just very saturated. there's a lot of competition, and I feel like you've got to be good and consistent quality wise, and also on top of it, be very persistent and ambitious in how you approach it if you're going to actually sort of like fight through the noise and get anybody to actually care about what you're saying. With that being said, there's a lot of people that sort of like compete in the space somewhat inauthentically and nefariously, who are either paid by labels to say this is good or that is good, or they're sort of like audience captured and they're afraid, like, you said earlier, to sort of like give a bad or a negative take because of like what could happen as a result of that in terms of them losing favor and losing audience or whatever. But I mean, the way that I see it at the end of the day, there's a lot of people that hate me over, one opinion or another. That's true. But simultaneously, like, they at least still come away from my videos, or at least see me as coming from a place where it's like, well, he actually feels that way, and, I think like if I did actually take an approach where I just like positively loved everything and said everything is great and there'd be no reason to sort of anticipate anything that I or anyone who sort of like takes that approach what we're saying, because it's like, oh well, that's him, he's going to like everything regardless and just say it's good no matter what it is. If you have some variation there and you're actually kind of like, genuinely critiquing things from an honest place, and you're reviewing on a regular basis and you're covering a lot of stuff, you're not going to like everything. As much as you would like to, as much as you would love to as a music reviewer, I'm sure we all would love nothing more than just to hear great music all the time, with no exceptions, nonstop, no project's disappointing, every project's amazing, every project is blowing us up. Wait a second. Like, okay, I know that you want to be critical and you want to, everybody needs a brick. I understand that, and I want to do that too. But the thing is, like, nobody necessarily wishes to hear music they hate, But the thing is, like, that's not reality. You're going to hear some music, you're going to hear some records you don't like eventually at some point. And if you're not honest about that, you're doing yourself and you're doing your audience a disservice.
I think that there used to be a bit more cohesiveness to the general musical community conversation. And when,
for sure,
Bobby Brown or whoever was hot, like we were all doing that, or we're all on Jay-Z, and I could walk up to somebody, even if I didn't really know them, and be like, what you think of Jay-Z's new album? And he's up on it or she's up on it, and we're talking about it. And I think now it's so bifurcated that generally my musical conversations are like, Anthony, what are you listening to? MC you've never heard of. What are you listening to? Oh, I'm listening to rapper X you've never heard of. Oh, and we can't really communicate that much. I mean, I think people who are in it are a little more cohesive on like, what is the last thing? So I ran into Anthony, we would talk about Cardi or whatever, or Kendrick, but like, I don't find an ability to connect with other people through music the way that I used to. And I think reviewing has sort of fallen into that, as there's less of an ability to talk to people about music in a way that's going to bind you together.
I mean, I think that's just kind of the nature of media consumption now, because there's just so much variety around everything that everybody is just kind of in their own little bubble, in their own little niche.
Yes.
And, I mean, even breaking it down just to sort of like a hip hop thing, like the Kendrick fans are not really listening to the Cardi record like the way the Cardi fans are listening to the Kendrick record. And, it just sort of like further fragments off from there. And that's even the case with like some of the most mainstream artists out there. I saw this ridiculous like podcast clip that was going viral on Instagram. It was like these 4 little white kids who were like maybe 12, 13, 14 tops. And, one of them just opened up this conversation. He's like, hey, so the new Drake album came out and I heard a song off of it. And what do you guys think? And one's like, oh, I heard a song from it off TikTok that I thought was pretty good. And the other kid was like, well, I haven't heard it yet, so I don't really know what to think. And the other guy's like, yeah, I mean, I haven't listened to it either, but I heard it's good. And that was literally the fucking clip. That was the clip they uploaded to fucking Instagram.
That is my conversation with my oldest child about television all the time. We had a whole conversation for 10 minutes about Squid Game, and I was like, when did you watch Squid? Oh, I watched a video about it.
Right. That's how I keep up with the Marvel Universe. I fell out of the storyline, so I just watch Emergency Awesome. He keeps me in the loop.
Yeah, it's like I have a YouTuber who I like, who I watched break down in a very sort of like funny and satirical way, break down that new show that Mr. Beast had. Who wants to watch the Mr. Beast show when you could just watch a YouTuber that you like tear it apart and make fun of it?
Right.
I like that show.
My girlfriend doesn't watch drama reality shows on Netflix, but she watches her two favorite drag queens make fun of them on a podcast on Netflix. Like, so I mean, why watch the show when you can watch two drag queens make fun of it?
Everything's so meta. We're all through the rabbit hole.
No, it's true.
Fellas, any final thoughts on anything?
You guys are the best.
Appreciate it. I mean, just the main thing to me is that the album review is still important because of context. I think context is is honestly even more important than opinion on whether it's good or bad at this point. That's what
because there's more opinions than there are context these days around anything.
There's
so little context around anything.
Yeah.
Read Greg Tate, the greatest music reviewer of all time.
Word up, man. Fellas, I really appreciate this. Again, I am greatly inspired by all three of you guys. I hope everyone watching this enjoyed the conversation. 9-second applause.
Justin Hunte is here, it's all happening. Justin Hunte is here, it's all happening. The mathematical breakdown of this mighty game of rap we in. It's boom happening. Systematical culture views, it's radical, it's all happening. Shaking hands and dabbing them. Life through the lens of hip hop, from trip hop to yes, y'all, you don't stop, you don't stop. Justin Hunte is here, it's all happening. It's all happening, yes, it's all happening. Justin Hunte is here, it's all happening. It's all happening, yes, it's all happening.